This is a Korean idiom that I really like. 시작이 반이다. So let's take a look at it. 시작, meaning the beginning or the start, and 반, meaning half. So literally, the beginning is half. And it's used to imply that simply starting something, you've already done half of what needs to be done. When it comes to starting a conversation in Korean, the most important part is just starting. But before we even get into the bulk of this lesson, I just want to guarantee you that if you focus on starting the conversation, you're going to have a lot more practice than someone who's focusing on what it is that they're supposed to be saying during the conversation. And you'll find that native Korean speakers are very understanding of other people who are trying to learn their language and eager to help and listen. So this video will be a little bit different than my other Korean FAQ videos because I wanted to give some tips for how you can start a conversation with someone else, whether online or in person. So let's talk about how to start a conversation in Korean. And the first tip that I want to give you is find something that you're confident to talk about. And this is the main tip that I can give you. In fact, you can even prepare what it is that you want to start the conversation with, or prepare a few conversation starters. And I'm going to give you some tips for that in this video also. Now, as a fluent Korean speaker, I can find lots of things to start a conversation about. I could comment on someone's outfit, ask directions, etc. But I couldn't always. And when I was a beginner, I remember struggling a lot just thinking of how I can start a conversation. So what I would recommend is to find something simple that you can comment about. For example, the weather is a great topic that you can talk about, and it doesn't really matter who you're talking with. You can start a conversation by talking about the weather. 날씨가 정말 춥네요. The weather is really cold. And the weather is a great topic to start with because everyone's thinking about it. If you're walking outside and it's raining, you can say, it's raining a lot, or the weather's bad, if it's snowing, if it's really hot, or if it's just really nice. You can always find something to comment that's related to the weather. And it even works with strangers to just randomly, start talking about the weather with a stranger because everyone's thinking about it. But let's say you're not outside or, you don't want to really talk about the weather. Well, let's say if you're in a restaurant then, here's a really basic phrase you can say. You could just say 맛있어요, or you can add in 정말 맛있어요. The food's really good. Now, you might not see this as a conversation starter, but again, the very beginning is the most important part. And this can lead to a conversation very easily. In fact, it does a lot whenever I use these sorts of expressions. Okay, so first, focus on something very simple that you can comment on. My second tip is to ask a simple question. And a simple question will even have a higher chance of starting a short conversation because they're gonna answer. For example, if you walk into a convenience store, you can ask where an item is, even if you think you could probably find it on your own. For example, 아이스크림은 어디 있어요? Where is the ice cream? Now, it's usually out in front or toward the front, but you could still ask. They're gonna at least point you to where it is, and they might start a conversation with you. If they don't, you've still done most of the work for starting one. Now, if they do point you to the ice cream, there's another thing you can even ask. I often ask this sort of question whenever I'm at any sort of restaurant or store. People like answering it. 뭐가 제일 맛있어요? For example, if you go into a convenience store and there's a college student working there, I can ask, 뭐가 제일 맛있어요? What's the best? And then they might say, I really like this one, or do you like this kind of flavor, or do you like this kind of flavor? And it can often lead to a short, simple conversation. Give it a try. Or when you're in a restaurant, in addition to just ordering your food in Korean, you can of course ask them what they'd recommend, or you can say something like, what is this item on the menu? You can ask what something is. Even if you know what the item is, you could still ask because they might make it differently at this restaurant. For example, if you didn't know what 군만두 is, you could ask, 군만두는 뭐예요? So what is 군만두? These are like fried dumplings. Or you can ask, what do you make them with? Whatever you prepare, whatever you feel comfortable with, just ask a simple question. And at the very least, it will lead to a simple answer, but it could and often will lead to a short interaction. Or what if you're outside? Well, you can stop someone and say, excuse me, where is? Ask for directions to wherever you're going. Are you inside of a museum? Ask where the maps are. Directions will always lead to a short conversation. Unless, of course, it's like right next to you, then they can say, oh, it's right here. But then you can still say thank you. Now notice that all of the examples I've given so far are just using beginner level Korean. That's on purpose. I wanted to show you that you do not need fluent Korean to speak some Korean. Okay, so the next tip that I have for you is trying to make eye contact. Just for a brief moment. You don't want to be just like staring at them from across the room. That's creepy in Korea as it is in other countries. But a quick glance will work. And once you've gotten their attention, you can give them a short nod, just kind of like saying, like, hey. And this conveys, I acknowledge you. And it also shows confidence. Like, I'm not diverting my gaze to stay away from you, but like, no, I acknowledge you're right there. Hey, I should say, don't do this to just random people on the street, just like staring at people, like giving them nods. I mean, it could lead to a conversation. That's not what I'm talking about. This would be people you're already interacting with in some sort of way. For example, say you get on a roller coaster ride with a stranger, but they're sitting like, right next to you or a couple seats over. You can kind of look over and say, hey, I acknowledge you. And that could lead to a conversation once you're finished. Or you could do this perhaps with someone working at a convenience store or in a restaurant, for example. Somewhere where you're already kind of interacting, in which case it's less weird than just to a random stranger on the street. The next tip that I have for you is, when in doubt, 안녕하세요. This is not just for beginners either. I use this all the time to say hello to strangers. 안녕하세요. Hello. It works great. It tells them right away, hey, I know some Korean, even if that's all you know. And it usually piques their interest because they hear someone who's not Korean speaking their language. Another example would be if you really needed their attention, you can just say 저기요, but then that kind of implies you're asking for something like excuse me, whereas 안녕하세요 is just hello, hey. And at the very least, even if this doesn't lead to a conversation, it won't always, it's still going to probably get you a smile and a hello back. The next tip that I have for you is a bit unconventional, but take a taxi and start the conversation by just asking the taxi driver to take you where you want to go in Korean. And you can do that by just using the 으로 particle, or 로 after a vowel, the location, and then 가주세요, please go. So 부산역으로 가주세요, please go to Busan Station. Most of the time, this leads to a short conversation. Now, let them guide the conversation. They might ask you a bunch of questions, like, where are you from? Where'd you learn Korean? What do you think about Korea? These sorts of things, and it'll usually be good practice. Keep in mind though, depending on the person and their age, it might also be good practice for dialect or older expressions, but that's fun too, especially if you're in Busan. I should note, however, you might do all of these things in Korean perfectly and they still reply to you in English. That's okay. They might simply want to practice English with someone, or they might not even believe their ears that you've just spoken Korean, and they might think you've simply just memorized one phrase and don't know anything else. But whatever the reason, feel free to just reply back in Korean. Now, if they are someone who actually does speak very good English, feel free to use some English as well if you'd like, but after you've first exhausted all of your Korean. Remember, the purpose of this is for Korean practice. And again, if there's only one message that I can get to stick with you for this lesson, it is the first idiom. Starting is half of it. And saying just one phrase, even just hello, is at least or more than half of the effort you need to put forward to get conversation practice. And saying even just one phrase, hello, is more than half of the effort you need to do. And of course, the more Korean you learn and the more practice you get, the longer these conversations can become. I once visited Isaac Toast, which is like a sandwich franchise in Korea, and we ended up talking about history, I think, for over an hour. Some people are busy though, and they won't talk for more than a few seconds, but in this case, it was memorable because the guy really wanted to talk. And this has also happened a lot when I've taken longer taxi rides, etc. So how do you usually start talking with a native speaker? Let me know in the comments below. I do check all of the comments. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. 그럼 다음에 또 봐.